Welcome to another Witcher lore video. It's been a few months since I last made a video on the vampires of the Witcher universe, so when deciding what to make today's video on, I thought about some of the vampires that are more common in The Witcher, and are also less powerful than say Bruxa or higher vampires. When searching through the books, I couldn't really find enough information on any of the lesser vampires to solicit entire videos about each of them, so I've decided to make today's video on the lesser vampires as a whole. To begin, you may be wondering what I mean by the term lesser vampire, but before I describe what it actually means, it's worth noting that the terms lesser and higher vampire are technically incorrect. It's just that the terms are now so associated with certain species of vampires that it makes the most sense just to refer to them as such, and many in the Witcher universe do also refer to them as such. Anyway, lesser vampires are vampires that aren't powerful enough to be classed as higher vampires, and therefore fall under the category of lesser vampires. To give you an idea, higher vampires include species such as Alps, Bruxa, Garkains, Mullahs, Nosferats, and of course the species actually known as higher vampire. Whereas lesser vampires include Plume Odds, Garkains, Ekimmaras, and Fledchers. However, in one of my sources, the book known as The World of the Witcher, Plume Odds are not mentioned to belong to either, and very little is actually known about them. However, I think it makes the most sense just to call them lesser vampires, as when they were mentioned in the books, Geralt doesn't exactly seem phased, and when he normally discusses higher vampires, his mood does definitely shift a bit. One of the main differences between higher and lesser vampires is the fact that lesser vampires are vulnerable to the sun, meaning that they exclusively hunt at night. Unlike true higher vampires, lesser vampires actually need blood. Although it isn't said whether they need human blood or if they could just live off any blood, it doesn't really matter, as they are very primitive and would just as easily kill a human as any other animal. Continuing with what I mentioned there, lesser vampires are much more cruel, primitive, and less intelligent than higher vampires. They seem to do most on simple instinct. For example, think about a true higher vampire like Regis, or even vampires just classed as higher, like Oriana and the Coroner. You can actually talk to them, but have you ever tried to talk to a Garcain? I'm telling you it won't go so well. When disposing of their prey, lesser vampires don't just drain the blood of their victims, they also like to eat their flesh, and some species even go so far to eat the bodies of the sick, but I'll get into that later. That's the basics of lesser vampires, but now I'm going to move on to talking about the individual species of lesser vampires. So to begin, let's talk about Fleders. Fleders are arguably the weakest of all lesser vampires, and even compared to a Garcain or Ekimmara, are not very intelligent. They often possess warty bodies with flat triangular faces and horn-like protrusions. Despite their generally flat face, they do also have protruding toothy jaws and are completely hairless. Let's just say they're not great to look at. They also possess the ability to regenerate, which is always useful, but their actual attacks are more the result of mindless rage than thought-out execution. They generally try to catch their prey by surprise by leaping and knocking them over, and they're said to drink the blood of even the sick and consume their bodies, which is poor even by vampire standards. Fleders are also pretty terrible flyers, with the membrane under their arms only allowing for short jumps and attacks from above. However, its hands do have small membrane extensions, allowing it to pin its targets down well. Despite being weaker than all of their kin, Fleders are still physically very strong. For example, they're said to supposedly be stronger than fiends. It is said by Geralt in the Witcher book Baptism of Fire that Fleders do not live in the climate of the Northern Kingdoms, which can help to explain why they're so absent in The Witcher 3. However, they did appear in The Witcher 1, but it has been said that a few have made their way past the Yaruga, and if you think about it, Vizima is much closer to the Yaruga than say Novigrad. There is also another species of Fleder that can only be found in one location in The Witcher 3, this location being the Unseen Elder's Cave. I will definitely make a video discussing this location in the future, but for now know that the climate of this cave is the closest we've come to knowing what the climate of the vampire homeworld is like. It is in this cave that we find the other species of Fleder known as the Proto-Fleder, and in the Witcher 3 Bestiary, it even states that Proto-Fleders have never had significant contact with the outside world, and therefore have spent their entire time, when in the world, in the Unseen Elder's Cave. This is actually why when Geralt meets them, he states that he's never seen a vampire like that in his entire life. Proto-Fleders as a vampire are unsurprisingly very similar to Fleders, except that they emit a strange glow. They appear to be just as weak as normal Fleders and possess the same attacks, but still, I wonder if perhaps these Proto-Fleders are closer to what Fleders would have looked like when they first arrived in the world, just based on the fact that they've had such little interaction with anything else. Or maybe they adapted to glow in the way they do because of this world. We don't really know, but this variation is still pretty interesting and quite cool that we can actually meet them in only one place. For the next species, we have Ekimmara. Ekimmara, despite not being as intelligent as, say, Garkains, is still said to be unusually cruel to their prey. Interestingly, there aren't really that many of them in The Witcher 3, and I believe at least in the base game, only 3 can be found. This makes getting Ekimmara hide very difficult. I'm pretty sure in Toussaint you can actually see some of them at certain points, but I'm pretty sure you can't actually fight them. There is one located in Dragonslayer's Grotto, one that can be found during a contract known as the Mystery of the Byways Murders, and one when first encountering Lambert in the quest known as Following the Thread. Now again, this does actually make sense, as in the books, Geralt states that Ekimmara do not live in the northern climate, but it has also been said that some have begun to habitate the north, hence why we can find a few. One thing I thought I'd mention is that during the contract that I mentioned before, the Byways Murders, the Ekimmara is actually named, and it is known as Sarasti. This vampire is basically just a slightly stronger than normal Ekimmara, but compared to say a Bruxa, is still pretty weak. It's not really known why it's named, but it was awakened accidentally, so perhaps it has some sort of history, but we don't know at the moment, but it's still cool that it's named and we actually get to meet it. Like many other vampires, they possess characteristics similar to a large bat. In fact, the Witcher bestiary refers to them as possessing a resemblance to an overgrown bat. Unlike Fleders, we can also see that they're not entirely hairless, but their faces are still pretty disgusting. Like Fleders, they can also regenerate, but they have another ability that seems to potentially put them on a more dangerous level than their cousin. When hit by their claws, you can bleed. A lot. So dodging is essential against this vampire. Ekimmara are also swifter than most of their lesser kin, and when pairing this with their ability to cause bleeding, they are clearly very deadly. On top of both of these abilities, Ekimmara also appear to possess the ability to temporarily turn invisible. So when adding their speed, ability to cause bleeding, and ability to regenerate health, they actually make for a fairly formidable foe. Anyway, moving on, let's talk about Garkains. Garkains are arguably the most powerful of the lesser vampires, possessing more abilities than their fellow lesser vampires, and on the whole, just simply being stronger. I mentioned earlier about how Fleders, despite arguably being the weakest, are still very physically strong. Well, Garkains possess the same amount of strength, but also appear to be slightly more intelligent. There is an interesting story surrounding Garkains, where it was discovered that 3 Garkains committed attacks in the city of Lan Exeter. Investigators said that when they arrived at the crime scene, the Garkains hadn't been content with just drinking their prey's blood, due to the blood and guts strewn everywhere, including the ceiling. They state that clearly they had joyfully torn their victims to shreds and then mucked about in their entrails. These Garkains were eventually slain by a Witcher. Garkains, as well as possessing sheer brute strength, also possess an array of interesting abilities. The first is their ability to jump great distances. The second is their ability to use mental energy to provoke visions in their prey, causing them to be disorientated. So basically when fighting them, they can stay back, disorientate you, and then jump on you with great speed, and from a great distance. Their strength is in fact so great that it is said if they are able to land their blows in quick succession, even Mahakam armor would be turned into tiny shards. Garkains also possess the ability to poison their prey. They do this by injecting venom into their victims, so as you can see, this vampire has clearly got a lot going for it. There is actually a more powerful variation of Garcain, and they are known as Alpha Garkains. They're basically the same as normal Garkains in most respects, except they are much stronger, generally act as pack leaders, and possess the ability to inject powerful venom into their prey. Of course, normal Garkains can also poison their prey, but I believe their poison is meant meant to be less potent. There's actually a whole story around meeting an alpha Garcain in The Witcher 3, and it's pretty dark, as when you kill it, it had just massacred an orphanage. This orphanage being the orphanage of Oriana. Finally, Garcains do appear to possess more intelligence than some of their fellow lesser vampires, as they seem to often gather other lesser vampires around them, and in such situations, they assume the role of leader of the pack. Like Fleders, Garkains do also appear in The Witcher 1, and the Witcher 1 bestiary even states that Garkains are uglier than Fleders, although of course that's subjective. Speaking about their appearance, I would say that they are mostly similar to Fleders, you know, just their general shape and the fact that they're hairless, except their head is clearly more rounded, and they don't appear to possess membrane wings of any kind. Finally, we have Plume Odds, and these are the lesser vampires that we know the least about. Plume Odds are mentioned briefly in the Witcher book, The Last Wish, and even in The Last Wish, all that's said is the price, 2 silver pennies, a Witcher used to charge for a contract on one. What might be worth noting is that the woman who said this to Geralt was reading from an ancient tome, so perhaps this species isn't even around anymore. From their Gwent art, it appears that they are a small bat-like creature, and considering that they are eating a hanging corpse, most likely act as the almost vultures of the vampire world. I could imagine them swarming enemies to attack, not really attacking groups of people or even individuals by themselves, just considering their size. Anyway guys, that's it for today's Witcher lore video, and I hope you've all enjoyed. I'm glad to have finally covered all the lesser vampire species, and I hope you've all learnt something new. As always, if you want to support videos like this and let me know you want more, I would really appreciate you liking today's video. Also subscribe if you're new, as I make Witcher lore videos every week, and if you subscribe you won't miss them. Also be sure to follow me on Twitter. And finally, a big thank you to the Patreon pledges. You guys are so awesome, and thank you all so much. I really appreciate your support, and I'm glad to put all of your names at the end of these videos. Also, thank you to anyone who just comments, likes, or subscribes, as obviously I really appreciate that too. Anyway guys, that's it for today's video, and I'll see you in the next one. Have an awesome rest of the week.